Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talks at Google. My name is Suzette, and I'm very excited to introduce today's guests, the co-founders of Fable, Michael Fox and Jim Fuller. Michael and Jim are here today to talk all about the mighty mushroom and how making mushrooms a bigger part of our diet can in fact help the planet. So with 38.5% of the world's habitable landmass currently devoted to animal agriculture, Fable is on a mission to help highlight the positive impact that replacing eating animals with eating mushrooms can have on our environment. Not to mention, mushrooms are jam-packed with antioxidants and immunity-boosting compounds. And mushrooms are arguably one of the most delicious foods, especially when prepared well, which we'll hear much more about in today's presentation and cooking demo. In fact, mushrooms' cellular structure and fibers actually resemble those of meat fibers, not plants. And they contain many of the same glutamates and flavor compounds as meat. What's not to love? So a bit more about the self-proclaimed mushroom-loving rebels who created Fable. Jim Fuller, who is the co-founder and chief science officer of Fable, began his career as a fine dining chef in Texas. Jim then went on to study chemical engineering and agriculture science before embarking on a career as a mycologist, aka mushroom scientist. And with over 15 years of experience in cultivating culinary, exotic, and medicinal mushrooms, Jim heads up research and development at Fable. And we also have Michael Fox with us today, who is the co-founder and CEO of Fable. Michael grew up as a meat-loving Queenslander, and he became vegetarian in 2015 for health, environmental, and ethical reasons, and has since adopted a fully vegan diet. Michael combined his passion for the planet with his healthy home cooking habits to create a whole food, plant-based meat alternative. That's Fable. So if you're joining us today from the live stream audience, we'll certainly have some time to take audience questions towards the end of the talk. So please do go ahead and submit your questions for Jim and Michael at any time throughout the talk in the live stream chat. All right, and now to kick off with the presentation, please welcome Michael Fox and Jim Fuller.
Thanks so much, Suzette. Thanks for having us. And
Sure.
yeah, it's a real thrill to join you too. I'm an ex-Googler. I was on the sales team in the Sydney office about 15 years ago for 3 years. So,
That's wonderful. Full circle.
Yeah. I used to love watching this talk. So really nice to join you. Thanks.
Amazing. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much for the intro, Suzette. And yeah, we wanted to take you through a little bit of the history of fungi. We'll talk through some of the health and environmental benefits of fungi. We've got a cooking demo. We want to make it easy for you and help encourage everyone to eat more mushrooms. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we do at Fable. But yeah, we're incredibly passionate about mushrooms and thrilled to be able to share some of that passion with you here today. So Jim, do you want to get into some of the history of fungi?
Sure. Well, hello, I'm Jim. And before I guess we get too much into us and what we do, we want to get a lot of information and excitement over about what mushrooms are and where they came from. So I normally tell this in a much larger and more detailed fashion, but I'm going to be pretty brief with it and take you back to, just the beginning of the earth and sort of walk you through to where we are now. So the cooling ball of rock and lava eventually starts being cool enough to hold some water on its surface. And in that, I don't know, I can't tell you how it started, but something sparked off all the little bits to start living and working together. And eventually some evolution occurs in there. That's one version of the story anyway. But all of that's happening within the stored water that's sitting on the surface of all that rock. There's no soil, nothing living on the surface really to speak of. Nothing really got the ability to get out of that water until fungi, the enterprising guy, decided that it was going to sort of evolve the ability to work its way, a little bit further away from those water bodies. And doing so started exerting a little bit of acid and a little bit of extra pressure at the end of these microscopic hyphal tips and literally carving out a little spot outside of the water for itself. But rock isn't enough sort of sustenance to thrive wholly, so it needed to be at least near or attached to the water where it could still live off the sort of dead and decaying organic debris there at the edges. But in doing so, that sort of really started the decomposer fungi getting out into the rock around it and sort of decomposing and breaking down the rock. And then other organisms started pairing up with fungi, and that really kicked off what was left to come for greening the surface of the earth. So fungi wrapped up a photosynthetic cyanobacteria that could produce sugars from the sun, and that's known as a lichen. That's a symbiotic organism that could now travel far and wide from the water. The fungi would do what it could do and mine into the rocks and still break that down, and the bacterial component would take the sun and the CO2 and make sugars, and that was a perfect little unit that could live. The fungi kept the inner bacteria just moist enough to live, and that really could spread outside of the water and develop the first sort of organic material out there covering the sort of surfaces of the earth. And as life cycles would happen, eventually those would die back, and those organic materials and layers would stay, and that begins to have the capacity to hold water and organic materials sort of outside of those oceans and rivers and sort of rock pools that are around. And then other things could sort of get the ability to take root and hold on outside of the water because those soil organic layers were being formed. But because fungi had that good foothold and a little bit of extra time outside, it really was the gatekeeper, and it would wrap up around and become the primitive roots of some of the first plants that were able to get out of the water. And then pretty much every tree, blade of grass, bush that's out there has a fungal symbiotic relationship that is just an expansion of its root system, brings moisture and minerals from around back into the plant, and in a relationship so that it gets the photosynthetic sugars. Um, that works really well to get the whole surface of the earth now soiled and having water systems, and it's got plants walking around on it, and even the animals that came out, they have this microbiome that's got bacteria and fungi on the inside to help keep it clean and healthy. So the fungi is really like the microbiome of the entire environment, including inside of the animals. And there are some things that tried to make their way in the world without fungi. And of course, if anyone's aware of the very popular current HBO show, The Last of Us, which is built on the very popular PlayStation game, that's built around a fungus called cordyceps, which is actually totally quite real. So if it didn't make a symbiotic partnership with fungi when it crawled out of the water, fungi figured out a way to take its toll anyway. And there are fungal parasites out there that actually take over the entire organisms and work into the brain and sort of do their own and make them do their own bidding. Really, there are three different ways that fungi get their energy and work their environment to a benefit, and that is they're the decomposers. Those are the ones that eat the dead and decaying organic material. Then there's the symbiotes. Those are the ones that work in conjunction with something else, and then there are the parasites. So looking at fungi for models, we can sort of really get a good understanding of how to kind of work with anything in the world to take it from a waste to a food, if we think about it in that way. And that's kind of the way that we've taken a think about it here at Fable. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and we can sort of continue on talking about sort of more of the health and environmental benefits. And for that, I'll hand it back to Michael.
Cool, thanks, Jim. So yeah, Jim's taking us through some of the history of fungi, and if you follow the evolutionary tree, fungi are actually more closely related to animals and humans than they are to plants. And there's actually a lot of similarities between mushrooms and us as humans, which can lead into some of the amazing sort of health and nutritional benefits of mushrooms. So just one example, if you take your store-bought mushrooms and sit them out in the sun for 10 or 15 minutes, they'll tan, they'll go darker, and they'll develop vitamin D in the actual mushroom. Exactly, it's a very similar process to what happens with our skin. And also, as Suzette touched on in her introduction, the cellular structure of mushrooms has a lot of similarities with the cellular structure of animals. You could cook the cells of mushrooms in ways that can mimic the flavor and the texture of meat, and we'll talk through some of that shortly too. But mushrooms are an incredibly healthy food, so I wanted to quickly touch on some of the health benefits of them. The two most commonly grown mushrooms in the world are the Agaricus bisporus, which is the white button, portobello, Swiss brown, cremini mushroom. All those mushrooms are the same species. It's called Agaricus bisporus. And it's native to France, and humans have farmed it for about 3,000 years. The second most commonly grown mushroom in the world is the shiitake mushroom. It's native to Japan, and it's the most commonly grown and eaten mushroom in Asian countries. And humans have farmed shiitake mushrooms for about 5,000 years. Shiitake mushrooms, both those mushrooms are incredibly healthy. Shiitake mushrooms are the most common ingredient in traditional Chinese medicine. They've got a whole array of incredible health benefits. And modern science has caught up to all of those health benefits too. So if they see a bit of sunlight, they're incredibly high in vitamin D. The mushrooms are also incredibly high in fiber. And a lack of fiber in Western diets is one of the biggest health issues that we have in Western society. Bowel cancer is one of the biggest killers, third biggest cancer killer in Western countries, and it's highly correlated with having a lack of fiber in your diet. And actually 95% of Americans, and it's a similar number of Australians, don't get enough fiber in their diet. So literally only about 5% of people in the United States and Australia are eating enough fiber. And that's because we eat so many of our calories come from animal products, so meat, dairy, eggs, and animal products contain no fiber. So because the average American is eating over 200 pounds of meat every year, in Australia we're actually even a fraction higher than that. We're getting so many of our calories from meat that we're not getting enough fiber in our diet. So supplementing some mushrooms into your diet is a great way to get your fiber up and be one of those people, the small number of people that are getting enough fiber. Just on some of the general population nutrition and where mushrooms can help there's a misconception that we need to eat more protein in our diets. And yeah, sure, if you're going to the gym and doing bodybuilding, you might need to sort of count the number of grams of protein that you're eating in your diet. But 98% of people in Western countries get enough protein in their diet. It's actually fiber is the big macronutrient that we lack in our diets, and mushrooms are incredibly high in fiber. There are also shiitake mushrooms and Agaricus bisporus mushrooms are also really high in iron, vitamin B12, and a whole array of other really healthy vitamins and minerals. So yeah, from a health perspective, we should all be eating a lot more mushrooms. Mushrooms are also an incredibly efficient way to grow food. As Jim touched on before, they're nature's decomposers. They grow on rotting material. So those two most commonly grown mushrooms, shiitake mushrooms in nature, grow on decomposing logs. They grow on wood. The Agaricus bisporus in nature grows in like rotting leaf matter, and you go for a walk in the forest and you'll see a lot of mushrooms are either growing on decomposing wood or in the leaf material in the forest. They're nature's decomposers. They help break down plants and other materials in the forest and return those nutrients back into the soil. And that's exactly how we as humans farm them. So they're grown on other waste streams from other industries. And they help decompose those waste streams to be turned into soil. So shiitake mushrooms, when they're farmed, they're grown on byproducts from the timber industry. So all the kind of sawdust, twigs, leaves, and things that come from the timber industry, those get compressed into logs, and then they're inoculated with the shiitake mushroom. The shiitake mushrooms grow on those logs. We get delicious mushrooms, shiitake mushrooms to eat, and then at the end of that process, all of the wood, all the lignins in the wood have been broken down and decomposed, and that can be returned as really good soil onto farms. And similarly with the Agaricus bisporus, when it's farmed, it's grown on offcuts from growing wheat, corn cobs, sugarcane mulch. All of that's decomposed by the Agaricus mushrooms. We get the delicious mushrooms, and then that can all be composted on the soil. So yeah, I live in Queensland in Australia, and my wife, 2 kids, and I have 41 acres here in Australia, and we grow a lot of our own food on our property and grow some mushrooms. And one of the things I love to do with my kids is we've got a local mushroom farm down here that grows button mushrooms and portobello mushrooms, and we pick up the take the trailer down, pick up the spent substrate from the farm, bring it back, lay it out under our trees, and we'll get another big flush of mushrooms growing on that substrate. So even though the farm has grown mushrooms on it, there's still more mushrooms that will grow on that spent substrate. And generally out of a sort of trailer load of the spent substrate, we might get sort of a bit over 100 pounds of mushrooms growing over the next few weeks, which we get to eat. And then my 6 and 4-year-olds have been setting up a little mushroom stand down at the end of our driveway and selling the mushrooms. The other weekend, they made $270 selling mushrooms down the end of our driveway. So it's kind of our version of the lemonade stand. One of the other really interesting things about mushrooms is, in addition to being nature's decomposers and breaking down waste streams from other industries, they are an incredibly efficient, land-efficient way to grow food. So Suzette touched on in her introduction that today, globally, 38.5% of the world's habitable landmass is devoted to animal agriculture. So yeah, just stop and think about that number for a minute. 38.5% of the world's habitable landmass is devoted to animal agriculture. It's a huge amount of the land around us. And the reason that's so high, there's two primary reasons. So firstly, most of the meat that we eat globally today is factory farmed, and those factory farmed animals have to be fed crops. And they're not a very efficient way to process crops into food. The cow needs to eat about 12 kilograms of plants to produce 1 kilogram of beef. For a pig, it's about 8 kilograms of plants for 1 kilogram of pork. So today, globally, more than half of the crops that are grown around the world aren't actually eaten by humans. They're grown to be fed to factory farmed animals. And it's an incredibly inefficient way to grow food. So you drive through sort of all the farming regions in the United States and Australia, and most of those crops, more than half of those crops, are actually being grown to be fed to animals rather than being eaten by humans directly. And then the second big reason that we use so much land for growing food is grazed animals are also an incredibly inefficient way to use land to grow food. And we did a little calculation the other day. So yeah, my wife, kids, and I live on 41 acres. If that was a square, it's about 400 meters by 400 meters, 1,200 feet by 1,200 feet. So decent size, but not huge. If we turned our entire property into an agaricus, a white button mushroom farm, we'd be able to grow enough calories, enough nutrition to feed 4,500 people, to sustain 4,500 people ongoing if this was a mushroom farm. If we were to convert our 41 acres into grazed beef cattle, we would be able to grow enough calories and nutrition to sustain 4.2 people. So it's literally 4,500 people if it's mushrooms, 4.2 people if it's grazed beef cattle. It's literally 1,200 times more land efficient to grow mushrooms. And that's if we just grew mushrooms in one layer. Mushrooms are grown indoors. So if we were to convert this to a mushroom farm, we'd build a big shed, but you can actually stack growing the mushrooms. You can grow them in high-rise buildings. So we could extend that efficiency even further. So if we were to, and this is obviously pushing the example to the extreme, but if humans were to stop eating animals and instead replace all of that meat with eating mushrooms, we'd be able to reforest almost all of that 38.5% of the world's habitable landmass that we devote to animal agriculture today. And if we were able to do that, if you did that in the United States, for example, without reducing any of your existing carbon emissions, reforesting all of that land would be such a big carbon sink. It would capture so much carbon that the United States would be carbon negative without reducing any of your existing carbon emissions. So the biggest single thing that we can be doing as individuals and as a society to help reduce the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions is to eat less meat. And we think mushrooms are a perfect replacement to help us do that. And so the average American eats a little over 200 pounds of animal meat every year and eats about 3 pounds of mushrooms every year. So we've got a long way to go before we switch everyone out from, that's our mission. We want to switch everyone out from instead of eating meat to eating mushrooms. We've got a long way to go, but to help you with that, we wanted to do a little cooking demonstration for you to show you some of the easy and most delicious ways that you can cook mushrooms. So Jim's pre-prepared a video, but before we play that video for you, I thought, Jim, do you want to just share a little bit of your background and how you got into this space?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Well, it was touched on right at the beginning, kind of the whole thing of it. But I did start out in Texas as a meat eater in Texas, of course. Um, but on a chemical engineering track because I was out in West Texas and it was all about petroleum. So chemical engineering was the goal. Um, I ended up being a fine dining chef for about 12 years in San Antonio on the River Walk there in San Antonio at a James Beard nominated place called Biga on the Banks. It exposed me to, lots of different ingredients and what I take away from that is it exposed me to things I'd never seen before, especially mushrooms, and I sort of gained a little passion for cooking them just then. I ended up moving out to California and lived just about an hour north of San Francisco in a place called Sebastopol and lived and worked on a mushroom farm out there. Um, and that's kind of where I fell in love with mushrooms and saw all these different culinary varieties and really started working and playing with those guys while I was walking around in the forest up there, putting names to all of them and just kind of falling further down the rabbit hole and knowing that mushrooms were kind of where it was going to be for me for the rest of my life. So whenever I actually moved over to Australia, I married a woman over married a woman over here, so I ended up moving over here. I actually started a farm making them, and then went back to school to get an agricultural science degree because that there was no other, it was never going to be fine dining or chemical engineering from that point. But I did eventually get a chance to sort of wrap up all those skill sets whenever I went vegan, and I did go vegan hardcore for a year because I was looking at a lot of the stats that Michael was just talking about. Mushrooms are super sustainable, and I'm selling that story every day. But then coming home and eating meat, and it wasn't working. There was a bit of cognitive dissonance. So I put together all these skill sets and sort of made something that would fill an emotional void that I saw that I had in my life as a vegan not eating meat. And I got to, to something that was convincing, and eventually got to the early stages and met Michael and started a business about the whole thing. So we've made a video just to talk about some of those little cooking things that are a bit different than what most people would ever know, because even all the cooking books in the world, they talk about mushrooms as if they were plants, and that's what we believe they were for most of human history, and a lot of us we just got it wrong because of that. We've said it a couple of times, but mushrooms are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So the stuff that's on the inside of the cell, the amino acid compounds and that, a lot more closely related to what you would find inside of traditional proteins. But as far as cooking and the structure, they have a cell wall, which is very much like what plants have. They have a cell wall as well. But in plants, the cell wall is made of cellulose, and in mushrooms, the cell wall is made of chitin, which gives them totally different physical properties. So in the video that we'll play next is me exploiting that for the very general button mushroom and showing that with just a little bit of a different technique, you end up with a stellar result, and it is so much more meaty than you could imagine. And usually at the end of what would be the video and me demonstrating this in person, you would get a taste of this and you would have no question. I guess we're going to have to ask you to use a little bit of your own imagination when you look at this and just think what it looks like and how it could be, and then go home and try it yourself. But yeah, I guess Mike, roll the video. I'm Fuller, co-founder of Fable. We are a food company who makes meaty, delicious food out of mushrooms. And today I want to show you a deep dive into boiling mushrooms. You may know that I espouse a method of cooking mushrooms, boiling them, that is a bit controversial in the space. A lot of people with any classical training might tell you that you should never let the mushrooms touch water before they hit your pan. And I'm here to tell you today that it's absolutely the right thing to do, and I want to walk through it, break it down. We'll go step by step and show you can do it fast and what it's actually doing to get the best texture and flavor out of mushrooms. The mushroom cell wall is made of chitin, not cellulose. Cellulose is ubiquitous in the plant world. Cellulose breaks down at or under 100 Cs. Chitin cells, with their elastic nature, not going to fall apart. That's why a mushroom stays in its form and you can't boil it apart. That's why you don't have to worry about over boiling mushrooms. So let's start using Agaricus bisporus. This is the common button mushroom. I've chopped a few up here. They're commonly sold in smaller and larger sizes, but they're all the same thing. And A chef might even call that the boring button mushroom, because it never really gets to be the showstopper. But to show you with this simple boiling method, it absolutely can be. All right, so I'm just going to whack in a pot. This is an induction cooker, so we don't have to worry about flames and smoke. I'm going to put just a couple of 100 grams in here, and I'm going to crowd it. Like, it doesn't really matter how much you start with. Crowding the pan is a good thing. This is another thing, that if you started in the traditional method, like say the French classical cooking techniques espoused by Larousse Gastronomique might say, you'd start in a pan with oil, and you need to spread them out in a single layer, and you could only cook layer by layer, and you have to wait. Well, no, that's not the case. I'm just going to turn this thing up really high. I'm crowding the pan with some mushrooms there. You see, I've just put those in there dry. And I'm going to add a small amount of water. So I've got this pan here halfway full. I want to say that's about 250 grams of mushrooms, maybe 300. And then adding maybe a third a cup of water. Maybe just a touch more because they're so big and meaty. You heard as soon as I put that in that it's already boiling on the bottom. Put the lid on and let the heat do its thing. So what's happening in there is mushrooms themselves, they have this very interesting structure. It's not a plant. It's not an animal. Actually, they're more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So that says that the stuff that's on the inside of the cell has very similar compounds to what you might expect in traditional proteins. So if we can get them out and work with them appropriately, we might be able to make them meaty. The structure of a mushroom, as it is a lot like a sponge. It's like a saturated sponge. Now I'm squeezing it and no water's coming out. It's like all the holes of the sponge are actually filled and sealed. But there is 92% moisture in this thing as it is. But doesn't matter how much I squeeze it, I'm not breaking apart the cells. But what I'm doing in here is I'm creating a chamber of pressure and heat so that that small amount of water turns to steam, and what it does is it creates steam to build up on the inside of these cells. And then they will burst almost uniformly right the way through, right to the inside of the mushroom. And when it bursts, it'll let out all this water. So I said they're like a sponge. And then when I said they're like a sponge, they're very much like this big, like car washing or dishwashing sponge, you know? But all these little holes are sealed. As soon as I put them in here and burst them with the steam, all the holes open up. And what happens is this is actually quite an elastic structure. People would know whenever you cook mushrooms, they shrink. They reduce in size. And that's about by half usually. What happens is this elastic structure, which we'll know later whenever we get into that meaty elastic bounce, actually when all the cells rupture, they collapse in on themselves, but they don't break apart from each other. And it's very much like turning this sponge into a very similar spongy material. This is the exact same thing, but with very small holes. So this is like a yoga mat. This is foam rubber. And it's very similar to that. Now that's an elastic structure that's been created after all of the pressure bursts all of those cells open, and it just sinks in. Now what happens then is most of the water from the inside of the mushroom gets evacuated and it goes into this equilibrium, which means that now the structure is not going to give off any more water, and it allows us to do the next step of what we want to do in cooking. It's been about 2 minutes, I don't know, I don't have a clock in front of me, but we've already got the mushrooms sort of swimming in their own liquid. I'm going to allow that to continue going, and I might even add a little bit more liquid just because they're so big. Every one of these pots is a little bit different, and every one of the cups is a bit different. You can totally do this with whole mushrooms. If you do this with whole mushrooms, it's going to take a lot longer for them to break down. It won't be 5 or 10 minutes just like this one. And these large sections of mushrooms are going to take probably about 5 or 6 minutes to break down, as opposed to the little buttons cut in half, something like that. All right, so now that we've got the mushroom getting rid of all its water into this solution, what's actually happening is all those flavor compounds that are on the inside, those things that are more closely related to animals than plants, now they're out in the solution, and we can actually start treating them like what you would treat those traditional proteins. Why? There's a lot of glutamates, glutamic acid, in mushrooms, and this is the umami compound. That's the thing, that's the sensation of comfort and pleasure in taste. Glutamic acid concentration is really high in mushrooms, in some more than others. Shiitake has a very high glutamic acid content. Agaricus bisporus has less. And it's different, and it's made different in its taste by the other amino acids and reducing sugars that are around. Now, with those things, you can see, they're definitely swimming in their own liquid now. With those things that have come out, they're reducing sugars, amino acids, plenty of things. There's not really any fats to speak of on the inside of mushrooms, so we're going to need to add that in a moment to carry this cooking forward, where we would typically, with traditional proteins, have a bit of fat coming out. So the Maillard reaction is the reaction in cooking where you get browning in food with three necessary things. You need amino acids, reducing sugars, and heat. Now, it's clear that with the mushrooms, I've got that. I've got the amino acids and the sugars pushed into the solution, and I'm taking the water down now because the water itself is what buffers me for achieving the right heat to get the Maillard reaction. That happens well above 100 C. But with the water in here, I'm buffered for temperature at or under 100 C. Even though steam goes higher, the water itself does not go higher than 100. So I don't have all of the components ready for that Maillard reaction until I've gotten rid of the water. But I don't want to get rid of the water until I'm certain that the mushrooms themselves have totally given up all their water, completely relaxed down on their elastic structure, which is their cook structure, and they're ready to go. Now, you can never overdo this so long as there's a bit of moisture in there. You're not going to break them down. Like I said, they're not plants. So you would expect boiling a plant, boiling a potato, boiling asparagus, that eventually that stuff is going to become soup. That's never going to happen with mushrooms. Mushrooms have that different polysaccharide structure that stays bound together. So I can do something like this, add a little bit more water, but I could continue to do that for days until I was totally ready and happy that this thing was fully ready to go. Now, as this last bit of water evaporates from the first deglaze of this pan, I want to show you that there's pretty much no residue left on the bottom. That's exactly what I wanted. I want to boil the mushrooms so that they collapse elastically. They give up all of that delicious flavor stuff into a broth, and then I reduce that broth down so that I can then work with the heat. But I don't want that stuff to get stuck on and stay on the pan. I don't want to serve the pan to anybody. I want it back on the mushrooms. So that's what a deglazing, that's the purpose of deglazing. So I just add that last little bit of water, get the last bit of brown stuff off the pan and onto the mushroom. And here is perfectly boiled mushrooms ready to go on to the next stage. So I say boiling mushrooms is the right thing to do. That's to get them to this stage. That means that they're perfectly cooked in texture. You're never gonna be able to overboil them. So once you've definitely got them to a stage where they're perfectly cooked from boiling them, you're ready to do the next thing. And the next thing is usually where people start. What's amazing is that no longer will I have to use large amounts of fats and oils to do the cooking on this. And neither will I have to layer them in single layers in a pan, because they're not going to be giving up large amounts of water to fight in the pan with fat, and they're not going to be absorbing the fat that I put into the pan. That's what would happen is if I started with a pan and fresh mushrooms, I would get the oil hot, I would place that saturated sponge into the oil. The oil would penetrate only one layer deep before it starts getting hit with steam, and as you know, the steam is going to be slightly above 100 C, but the water that's in the barrier right next to it is going to be at 100 C. So you're always fighting to push heat into mushrooms if you start with oil on the outside. But if you start by boiling, you're getting that elastic structure collapsed, you're getting all the flavor out, and you're getting ready to push heat into the mushrooms. So now, with just a small bit of oil as compared to what I would have used for this 350 grams of mushrooms or 300 grams of mushrooms, whatever I started with, I would have very easily used already 4, maybe 5 tablespoons of oil just to get them to this stage. But now that they're at this stage, I can do so many things with them. I could take them from here and now marinate them, because what's going to happen is diffusion and osmosis, and you're going to get waters and sugars moving around, sugars and salts moving around, and you'll be able to flavor them from here by setting them in a marinade. Or you can just simply put them into a pot with your favorite cooking oil and go with high heat. What's not going to happen is it's not going to be absorbed on the inside. It doesn't have the mechanical pressure anymore to suck the oil back in. So what's going to happen is that oil is going to stay on the outside, and what's going to get pushed into the mushrooms is heat and heat alone. And that's what we want for the Maillard reaction. The Maillard reaction is not only going to happen on the outside forming a crust, it's going to be driven right into the mushrooms, so long as I can push the heat. So that's what I want to do. I want to push the heat in, and I want to push it hard. I'm going to do that with a bit of oil. This I'm just throwing in a little bit of extra virgin olive oil. I put in about a tablespoon of oil there. And it's going to be well enough for the whole amount of this mushrooms and more. I want to get that hot. Like I said, the Maillard reaction is going to occur on the inside of mushrooms as well as on the outside, because I'm pushing heat in, and nothing is getting sucked in. All the oil is staying on the outside, continuing to be at the surface of the heat, and it's going to drive that heat into the mushrooms. And you'll see the color change, which is entwined, correlated directly to the flavor change. So this, I want high heat. There's so much moisture still in these mushrooms. There's still, even though they started at 95% moisture, even now they're at about 90% moisture. How is that possible? It's because the stuff that was on the inside of the cell has come out into the solution, so they've actually lost some of their physical weight into the broth. And the stuff that remains still has a very high moisture content, so it's going to be very difficult to burn because of that. But you can see that because the water is evaporating away and there is no fight going on with the oil and the water that's in the mushrooms, you're getting an almost instantaneous Maillard reaction at the surface. And you see, that's happening very quickly now. I want to drive that heat as much as I can. I typically would cook this on a wok. I would cook it on anything that had a high flame. Induction burners can do the job. You just got to take them up to their very top. You can do this on your home stove, but yeah, it does take a little bit more time because it's really hard for those things to push out a whole lot of heat. But you can see it's happening here already. You're getting those beautiful toasted golden colors. This is probably about a minute in. I would expect that it's going to be 3 to 5 minutes to be totally finished with something that is already cooked to a degree that most people haven't seen. And of course, you can just keep going and driving the heat into the mushrooms in this method. The best way to do it is just keep the heat coming and go with more heat if you have it, so long as you can just keep them moving. They'll tell you that they are cooking. They'll tell you when they're done cooking, and you'll start smelling a stench if you've not moved them around. So just keep them moving. You can see with the high heat, ideally what you want to see is a bit of steam coming off there. You can do this on your home stove. It's just going to take a little bit longer. Now you can see that lovely developed umami that's happened on the outside. Now it would be a good time to go in with the aromats that you want to finish the dish with. So at this point, I would typically put in garlic, onion, thyme, and that's what I have here. But that's not what you have to do. You could take this now to the rest of your recipe. Now you can make this into, the cream sauce and develop your cream sauce from here. Or you can make it into the soup and develop your soup from here. Whatever it takes to do that, you have now appropriately prepared the mushrooms all the way to a satisfactory level. Your guests would love this just as is. But going in with a little bit of onion and garlic, a little bit of thyme, and just a splash more olive oil, and you give that stuff another minute or so. And you can see the Maillard development all over these mushrooms.
the longer you go with this, the more heat you're going to drive in, and the more color development you're going to get right through the mushroom. The smaller the pieces, the faster it happens. The larger the pieces, the longer it takes. If you did this with a whole mushroom, that would be delicious. But you would need to help it along, and you might take a pot lid or something and press that inner moisture out. You can hear it. Press that inner moisture out and just accelerate those larger mushrooms. But the larger mushrooms, just as delicious, and they do something completely different for texture. Let's give that another 30 seconds for the garlic and onion to cook, and I'm going to give it a finish of a splash of water because I want to wash anything that's stuck on the pan back onto the mushrooms, and then finish with the seasoning. You can see that's pretty hot in there. That last little bit is going to help to make whatever soluble polysaccharides around the mushrooms still remain, give it its own creaminess. But of course, a little bit of salt, a little bit of cracked black pepper, and once it's taken off the heat, a dollop of your favorite sort of butter, and you just fold that in. Now that's mushrooms done the right way, starting with boiling, and so much flavor development has occurred. Throw it out on a white background for you to get an idea of that wonderful golden color. There you go. That's agaricus mushrooms cooked by starting with boiling. The boiling method has taken them to a perfect texture, has gotten out all of those beautiful amino acid compounds for me to then caramelize and cook with the typical cooking methods, but far less oil. And then I got to season it right at the end after I've developed all the flavor in the mushrooms. These are an umami bomb. Thank you very much.
Awesome. We host a lot of mushroom foraging tours, and normally, as Jim mentioned, we would serve these up to you after doing that cooking demonstration. So apologies if we've got you all hungry and now you can't eat them out of the demonstration. It's 6:45 a.m. in Australia, and I'm craving mushrooms for breakfast, so I'm going to make some on toast after this call. But yeah, I thought I'd give you a little quick. We've talked a lot about mushrooms. I thought I'd give you a quick background on what we do at Fable, and to lead into that, I'll just share a brief bit about my background. So, as Suzette touched on, I went vegetarian 7 years ago, vegan 2 years ago. For me, kind of all of the reasons, but yeah, health, environmental, and ethical. I found it really hard to go vegan. I grew up in Queensland, which is Australia's equivalent to Texas. I grew up eating a huge amount of meat, and yeah, I didn't give up meat because I don't like the taste of it. Quite the opposite. It was really hard because I did love the taste of meat. And so as I was reducing my meat consumption and eventually eliminating it, I started exploring different ways to eat food that would sort of still satisfy me in the way that meat did. And as I was on that journey, I sort of settled on wanting to help other people reduce their meat consumption as well. So I tried my hand at activism, and I think in 7 years I've managed to convince 3 people to turn vegan, 2 of whom work for Fable, which probably doesn't really count, and the third I caught up with the other day, and he's back eating meat. So I'm obviously a pretty terrible activist, but I could see out of all those conversations, people, they get the reasons why they do want to reduce their meat consumption. It's just hard because meat from animals does taste really good. So I sort of settled on, okay, well, maybe the best way I can contribute to this is to give people delicious meaty food, but make it out of something other than animals. So as I was exploring doing that, I was sort of thinking through, I'm also a very healthy eater. As I mentioned, live on 41 acres. We grow a lot of our own food, shop at local farmers markets, bake sourdough, brew kombucha, eat a very minimally processed whole food-based diet. And so I wanted to develop a meat alternative that aligned with that diet, wanted to use really natural, healthy ingredients. And so I was exploring different ingredients that I could use, and settled on the idea of using mushrooms as a base ingredient for all of the reasons you've heard Jim describe in that video and earlier. And so as I was exploring mushrooms, I had about 5 different people say to me, if you want to do mushroom-based meat alternatives, you've got to meet this guy, Jim. You've got to meet this guy, Jim. So Jim and I met a little over 4 years ago, and Jim's obviously got got the really strong scientific and culinary background in mushrooms, as you've heard. And so, yeah, we teamed up to co-found Fable, where our mission is to help end industrial animal agriculture. And we do that by making delicious meaty food out of mushrooms. So the way we go about doing that, we use those two most commonly grown mushrooms in the world, the Agaricus bisporus and the shiitake mushroom. You know, as we're starting the business, we wanted to make sure that with that mission in mind, we wanted mushrooms that we could scale into. So there are thousands of amazing culinary species of mushrooms that all have really unique, interesting, delicious properties. But we wanted to work with mushrooms that are farmed at scale so that we could help and have a big impact. So we use the Agaricus and shiitake mushrooms, and we basically do a lot of the work that we would encourage you to eat a lot of fresh mushrooms and cook them boil them like Jim showed you in the video. But we also we develop products where we've kind of done that process, as well as some other unique cooking steps to make delicious meaty food out of the shiitake and Agaricus mushrooms and make it really easy and convenient for people to be able to eat like this. So we have a couple of products on the market. We have a pulled meaty mushroom product, and actually, Mike, if you don't mind just popping the slides up. Can show you some images. So we have a pulled product that replicates kind of a pulled beef or a pulled pork, and it's made from primarily the shiitake mushroom. We sort of take the shiitake mushroom and we shred it, so you get that shredded meat texture. We boil it and some other really simple but delicious cooking processes. And our products are on the menu. We distribute in Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, Singapore, Canada, and New Zealand. So you can jump on our website to see where they're available, but we focus primarily in the premium food service segment. So we work with Michelin star chefs like Heston Blumenthal in the UK, through to sort of the premium quick service restaurant segment. So like Honest Burgers in the UK, actually in the United States, we're about to launch into STK Steakhouses and Kona Grill. In Australia, we're in Guzman and Gomez Grilled Ribs and Burgers. That pulled meaty product can be used on sort of burgers. I'll show you a few other different images. These are some of the dishes that the British Michelin star chef Heston Blumenthal's done in some of his restaurants. Singapore, we're in a chain called Salad Stop that use us on their salads. Beatnik in New York City they change their menus, but often have our product on their menu. A whole range of different dishes that you can use with our product. Thanks, Mike. We can take the slides off. We'd encourage you to cook fresh mushrooms, substitute more mushrooms into your diet in the way that Jim's shown you. If you do, we don't really do a lot of retail, but if you do want to buy our products in retail in the US, you can order them online from GTFO Vegan in the UK, Planet Organic in Australia, lots of premium independent retailers, and the Vegan Grocer in Singapore, the Good Food People, and in Canada, Effie. We try to make it easier for you with our products, but you can also do a lot of amazing things with fresh mushrooms and use that boiling method that Jim shared. That's us. Yes, Suzette, happy to take any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much for everything, the insightful presentation and the cooking demo. I definitely do wish we were doing this in person so I could at least try that, but I will try it at home for sure. So before we jump into audience questions, I had a couple questions, but I wanted to ask about, watching the cooking demo. I previously had not heard of nor tried a boiling preparation style. So I guess question for you, Jim, when did you learn how to boil mushrooms? Is this like a process that came from studying the science behind it, or is it some kind of well-kept secret for some?
Yeah, it's an antithetic thing. Like all the cooking information for all the decades would tell you that you need to treat them with really intense heat and oil or flame without letting them touch water. So it was a discovery, because I actually lead lots of mushroom tours. Michael talked about that a little bit earlier. We take people out into the forest, and I just did this as a labor of love for a good decade here in Australia, where I would just take people out into the woods, or the bush as we call it over here, and we'd harvest mushrooms, and I'd help them identify them, and then we'd collect them all, bring them clean them, and then cook them all. But it's really hard to do lots of mushrooms at one time because those classical methods would have you lay them out in a single layer, brush them all off, never wash them. You can't touch water. But then I found that I was actually preparing large amounts of mushrooms, and they would make their own liquid to boil in, essentially, if I put too many in the pan. But those ended up actually being better than the ones that I would lay out in a single layer, and they would actually come through faster so long as I followed the purpose of boiling them faster. If I put in a lot of water, they're going to take a long time to boil. If I put in a whole bunch of things and I'm trying to fry them, it's not really going to happen very well. But if I approached it with the intention to boil them, get all their liquid out and get rid of it, then I had something that was so versatile and so quick to cook and actually ended up so much better. And why it ended up so much better, well, then I could dig into, all of the stuff about the amino acids, the reducing sugars, the Maillard reaction happening better, faster, more efficiently. So yeah, it took a couple of years to actually just be in the thick of it doing it, but then really realized, hey, there is something here. And once focusing on it, it took no time at all to really understand, hey, these things are something completely different. No one's talking about it. Let's do something with that.
Wow, that's really cool. Very, very cool. And I guess one other follow-up question. So Michael, is the Fable product line, let's say, is that essentially like the point after the boiling is completed? Or is that kind of a ready to go, product that I could buy and just like heat up and eat?
Yeah, the latter. We try to make it as convenient as possible for you. So the pulled product comes in. It's shiitake mushrooms that have been shredded. They've been boiled. We got a couple of other cooking steps in there as well to make them really, really meaty and delicious. And then we form them into kind of meatball size sort of chunks. And so you can take those. You can put them into you probably give them a little light fry off in the pan in some oil, and then you can put them in a curry and in a stew. You can dice them up and put them in a stir fry. You can shred them, do like a pulled meat style burger. So yeah, we've tried to make it as easy and convenient for chefs in restaurants and particularly quick service restaurant chains to use, as well as for you to use at home.
Awesome. Very cool. All right, let's pull up some audience questions. All right, the first one from Elias. What are your thoughts on store-bought mushrooms, which aren't generally grown on sterile soil?
You go for it, Jim.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of different things there. So exotic mushrooms, the ones that grow on wood, so like shiitake, oyster, those wood-loving mushrooms, they typically are grown from a sterile soil because that's just part of their production method. They have to take sawdust straight from a tree, mix it together with some nitrogen, and then actually sterilize it so that only the oyster or shiitake will grow. In the case of a button mushroom, like the Agaricus bisporus that I cooked in there, those guys will grow in the forest and field. And to replicate that in a farm setting, they actually make a compost and they pasteurize the compost and allow whatever microbiology that's going on in the soil to sort of finish its job and then inoculate with the white buttons. So it's actually kind of a selective media, but it does have lots of other things in it. So it's not sterile. So where you could say agaricus mushrooms are coming from a non-sterile soil, they're absolutely coming from something that's like almost totally composted. And to eat that stuff itself would give you a good dose of like vitamin B12 and not necessarily going to be too bad for you. So my thoughts on eating things that aren't coming from sterile soil, excellent. And with the method that I've just shown you, there's absolutely no reason not to wash them first. That little extra bit of water from washing them is going to help sort of ignite that boiling method anyway. So no worries from a non-sterile source. Pick them off from the forest floor, throw them into the boiling water, give them a lot of high heat. You're only getting more and more nutrition out of it.
Awesome. Very cool. All right, let's take another question from Maria. Any thoughts or best practices on keeping a shiitake log thriving at home?
Yeah, I actually have quite a bit going on in my backyard because we do tests all the time for growing efficiencies at Fable. But yeah, definitely you don't want it in the sunshine. You want to keep it in a cool environment. And that's like all the time. You don't want it to fluctuate through really highs and really lows, but really lows are okay. But really highs will stop your production. And you want to keep it in an area that has at least some humidity as a portion of time. So out of the sun and with some moisture. So if that's under a tarp, in the shade, up against some sort of a thing in your backyard where the hose is like always got a little bit of a drip on, that's like a most primitive way to go. But if you're going to care for it, absolutely keep it in the shade. You know, a little bit of a daytime light illumination is fine, but not direct sunlight. And then you just don't want it to get too hot. And they will, if it's from a natural log, they'll yield you a couple of times a year until you can actually pick the log up and feel that all the weight's gone out of it because it's kind of been degraded and come off as mushrooms.
Oh, very interesting. Cool. And so that's the shiitakes or mushrooms you would then grow outside. Is that?
Oh yeah, you can totally do this. And a lot of people who
Cool.
do this as an early return from a timber product, you know, so like people grow trees. It takes 20 years to get, you know, something that they can cut down and sell. But from their early trimmings, they'll actually inoculate with shiitake spawn and then set it out underneath the trees because that's in the shade and it's got a nice, you know, moist forest environment. And you'll get an early sort of non-timber forest product that you can sell out of the forest.
Wow, very cool. All right, let's see. We have time for one more question from Terrence. I've heard that mushroom agriculture is a major consumer of single-use plastics. Is this being addressed in the industry?
Jim, do you want to touch on it, and then I can finish up?
Yeah,
I can add to that.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so for Agaricus bisporus, that's not necessarily so much the case, where they're grown in big trays, large rooms that use everything's pretty much reusable. But for the smaller farmers, they do grow them in big, like 50 kg single-use bags. And yes, that is being addressed in the industry because with Agaricus, these things can be pasteurized, so they don't need a specialized plastic so much. So as plastics come along that are more biodegradable, those are getting implemented into those sort of production systems. The other ones are the exotic mushrooms, the shiitakes, the oysters, the things that are put inside of bags and then sterilized. Yes, there are production systems now that are going to a lot of reusables, but it is a difficulty to get to get very thin plastics that are biodegradable, that are sterilizable as well. But there are some recent innovations in that, and of course, you know, a lot of the mushroom growers are concerned about that same thing. It is something that's at least in their mind and being addressed at the small scale, hopefully much larger as we go.
And in addition to that being addressed, it's also worth just keeping in mind the kind of scale. So the ideally we would use less plastics in mushroom farming, and that is happening. But in terms of the impact of land use, 38.5% of the world's habitable land mass being devoted to animal agriculture, that is a far more significant problem than some plastic use in mushrooms. Also, another one is carbon emissions. So beef emits about 60 kilograms, about 140 pounds of carbon per kilogram of beef that's produced, and mushrooms, it's less than a kilogram or less than a pound of carbon emissions per kilogram or pound of mushrooms that are grown. So they're about sort of 80 times less carbon emissions for mushrooms. So there is some improvements to be made in plastic use in mushrooms, and the industry is working on that. But the other benefits of mushrooms far outweigh any of those costs that are there at the moment. But it's a good question.
Yes, and really good points all around. So, Michael, Jim, thank you so much for sharing your vast knowledge and perspective with us today. This was really insightful. And for anyone watching who wants to find out more about Fable, as well as get some excellent mushroom-based recipes, you can go ahead and visit their website, fablefood Co. Thanks again.
Thanks, Suzette. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Suzette.